it's Jess from Sallie Tomato and welcome to my channel. Today I am going to show you how to install fabric covered strap connectors. This is a very unique hardware. You can cover the center of the hardware with whatever fabric you'd like. I'm going to show you a couple different techniques for installing the fabric and installing the hardware, and I think you'll be impressed with the results. It takes a little bit of practice to get this hardware installed, but I'm confident that you can do it. So let's get started. To get started, you'll need to gather a few supplies. You'll need some fabric for your project. You'll need one set of fabric covered strap connectors. These come in a set of 4, and included with the hardware, you have a metal square that's screwed to the center. And you'll also get a template to cut out the fabric. Also with your hardware are metal washers. And there are 2 types of washers that you might receive, and it just depends on what we have in stock and what my hardware supplier sends us. So this type here, you'll only need 1 washer per connector, so you'll have 4 of these included with your set. Otherwise, you might receive these, and you'll need 2 of these smaller washers to install each connector, and I'll show you how to do both. This hardware also comes in a gold and an antique finish. You can also choose from a gunmetal finish and a rose gold finish. To install this hardware, you'll also need a screwdriver, a seam ripper or a really sharp pair of scissors, a hot glue gun, a marking pen or some tailor chalk, a scrap of fusible woven interfacing, and you might also need some foam stabilizer or some heavy-duty firm stabilizer to help add a little bit of support to your hardware depending on your project. So to get started, you're going to take the template included with your set of hardware and cut it out around the outer edges. After your template is cut out, you're going to take the material that you want to cover the center of your connector with. So you can use a variety of materials to cover your strap connector. If you want to use cotton or canvas or any fabric that frays, then I recommend to add a little bit of interfacing to the back. You can use the Bosal lightweight woven interfacing, and just adding a layer of that or even a non-woven interfacing will help prevent the edges from fraying and give it a little bit more stiffness for installing it on our hardware. My personal favorite is Touch Pro Light cork fabric, and this is as thin as quilt weight cotton, so this is going to be really easy to cover that center square, but it's not going to add a lot of bulk. So this is a really nice choice, and it doesn't fray at all. You could also use cork fabric, standard Touch Pro thickness, or vinyl. Just make sure that your material isn't any thicker than 1 millimeter wide. So if you want to use cork, I'll show you how to do so and how to eliminate some of the bulk. So it might be a little bit more challenging, but if you want it to match your bag, this is a really fun option. So let's start with the more challenging option first. So if you choose cork fabric or a vinyl. So I'm going to set this piece aside, and you're simply going to trace your template onto the wrong side of your material. And I'm just going to use a standard ink pen because it'll be easy to see and we won't see it once our hardware is installed. Once it's traced onto the wrong side of your fabric, then you can cut out the piece. Next, you're going to take your hardware and unscrew the blank square from the hardware. So you can set aside the front piece of the hardware and the 2 screws. And we're going to work with this blank metal square first. So take your hot glue gun and apply a thin layer of hot glue to the center of your fabric. Then notice on the connector the screw holes. You're going to want to line those up with the indented sides of your fabric. And center it and glue it in place. Then we're going to start with these angled sides. And on the edge of the metal piece, you're going to add a thin line of hot glue. And fold that side up and hold it and allow it to cool and dry a little bit. And then you're going to repeat for the other side. And then you're going to put some glue on the inside of the connector in the corners. And you're going to wrap the fabric around and hold it in place and allow it to cool. And then you'll repeat for the other side. And it tends to want to pop off, but once we have it screwed in, then it will hold and you don't have to worry about it coming apart. But I found that hot glue is the easiest option for holding the cork fabric in place. I've tried other craft glues and permanent glues, and they just don't dry quick enough. So then we're going to repeat for the opposite sides that have the screw holes. And wrap these sides nice and tight. And these sides, I'm going to redo this one. I try to add some glue and then I almost fold it at an angle inwards and hold it down to try to conceal some of that raw edge. Okay, and then you'll repeat for the other side. So here's what your connector will look like once you have the fabric glued to it. And now we're going to screw it to the hardware. So first I like to clean up this a little bit so you can see that the corners aren't quite at a 90-degree angle. This one sticks out a little bit more. So some are a little bit more bulky than others. So I'm just going to take my scissors and I'm going to shave these corners a little bit and get rid of some of that bulk and just kind of clean it up. And you don't want to take too much off because then you might start to see the metal of the hardware. But that looks pretty good. And you can always trim more. So start by just trimming a little bit and seeing how it looks. So I'm going to set the screws aside for a moment. And you'll line up those screw holes with the holes on the hardware. And just press it down and tuck it in. And that looks pretty good. So if you needed to, you could just pop this out and shave off a little bit more from the corners to just kind of clean it up. But I think we did a pretty good job. So then you're going to flip the hardware over to the wrong side. And before I add in the screws, I like to just fill up this whole area with hot glue. At this point, you could also use a permanent glue like E6000 or Loctite. And that'll just help hold that center piece even more. Then you're going to take your screws and screw the hardware in place. And with the cork fabric, usually I like to put the connector down on the table and then I press down and I screw. Just to make sure that you get it nice and tight because this is a thicker material that we're working with. And here is what our hardware looks like when it's done. So now I'll show you the thinner option. So it'll be the same process with the thinner fabric. You're going to trace the template on the wrong side and cut it out. So we'll start by doing that. So you can set aside the main piece of the hardware and the screws and start by taking that blank square again. And it might be easier to apply the hot glue directly to the center of the square. And then you can just press it down in the center. So then you're going to wrap in the sides. and glue them in place. And you shouldn't have to trim off any of the fabric on the corners. And here's what it looks like once it's done. So if you wanted to, you could shave off a little bit of the extra on the sides, but I think we're pretty good and we can go ahead and install this just as before. Alright, so now that we have our connector covered with fabric, now we're ready to install it in our project. Another tip to make sure that your corners are nice and clean, I like to take a stiletto and then you can just kind of push in and tuck the rest of your fabric in on each of the corners. And I love how professional this hardware turns out. I'm going to show you two methods of installing the hardware. One is if you already have your project interfaced. So for example, this is a piece of cork fabric and I've already stitched on a piece of Bosal foam stabilizer. Otherwise, your project might be very thin and you might just be installing it on a piece of cotton or canvas. So I'll show you how to stabilize your hardware if you use just a single piece of fabric as well. So starting with the stabilized piece of fabric, you're going to take your connector and you're going to bend the prongs so they're perpendicular to the hardware. So just bend all of them outwards, so they're standing straight up. If your hardware came with this style of washer, you'll notice that you can use this as a template to mark the prongs on your fabric. So if you poke the prongs through the washer, then you'll notice that they come through on about the center, but a little bit more towards the edge of each of those slits. So then you could take this piece and center it over your placement according to your pattern. And then you could just take your pen and mark those prongs where they poked through on the washer and just use that as a template. If you don't have this style of washer and you received these narrow ones, then there are a couple of options to mark where the prongs are going to poke through. So you can position this on your project and then simply just press down hard and it will leave an impression on your material. Then you can take your pen or your chalk and mark where those impressions are, and that'll be where your prong marks are. Otherwise, you could just position your connector and then take your marking pen and then just do little marks where the prongs meet on the fabric. Another technique is to take a piece of tailor's chalk and to rub it against the back side of the prongs, so that way it leaves a little bit of chalk dust on each end. And then you can place it on your project and press down, and then it'll leave a little bit of chalk left on your project, so then you know where to cut the slits, which is nice. So either method, whatever works best for you. Then you're going to take a seam ripper and you're going to cut where each of the slits are. So it's just a small little hole. Make sure you poke through all the layers and just cut a slit about 1/8 of an inch long. If you rather, you could use a pair of scissors and you could poke through the fabric with your scissors, or you can just fold your fabric and then cut a little snip where each of the prongs are. Just make sure if you use your scissors, it goes all the way through the layers. So I'm going to go back to using my seam ripper because I know that I can get all the way through with that. And it's a good idea to start small and work your way up. You want a nice tight fit for your prongs. So just start by cutting a small little slit, and if you need to, you can always go back and cut a little bit of a wider slit. Then you're going to take your hardware and poke the prongs through those holes that you just made. And then you're going to flip it over to the wrong side. And And you're either going to take your single washer and place it over the prongs. And I like to press down on the washer to make sure everything's nice and tight, and then I bend all the prongs outwards. Otherwise, if you're using these type of washer, this is just a universal washer that has multiple slits in it, so this is used for a variety of hardware. So you'll just see which holes the prongs poke through best, and then press it down and bend out the prongs that way. So just make sure that your prongs are standing up nice and tall and straight. Put your washer on and bend away the prongs. And then your hardware is installed. And it is super strong, it's not going anywhere, and look how professional that looks when you have that center square match your project. One last tip is I like to take a scrap of woven interfacing and just place it over the back side of your project and cut out a piece that is a little bit bigger than the washers. And it can just be eyeballed, it doesn't have to look pretty. And you're going to fuse it over the back side of your hardware. And this will just help protect the inside of your bag and your lining from the metal from the washers. Now I'm going to show you a few tips on installing the hardware on a piece of fabric that doesn't have any stabilizer attached to it. So you're going to start by bending the prongs outward again and marking the placement. Then you're going to cut the slits just like before. This time you're going to take a scrap of stabilizer, and it can either be a foam stabilizer or a heavy duty stabilizer, and you're going to cut a piece that's just a little bit bigger than your hardware. This time you're going to take a piece of foam stabilizer or a heavy duty stabilizer, and you're going to cut out a piece that's a little bit bigger than your hardware. Then you're going to transfer the prong markings onto this piece as well and cut the slits. Then you're going to take your hardware, and first you're going to poke it through the holes on your fabric and flip it over to the wrong side. And then you're going to put the prongs through the holes in your piece of foam or your stabilizer. Then you'll attach your washer to the back, just like we did before, and press down and bend the prongs outwards. And then your hardware is installed. So that way, with the extra stabilizer, you have a nice tight fit and your hardware isn't loose at all on your material. I love how professional this hardware looks when it's done. When people see the bags that I've made with this hardware, they can't believe that I made the bag myself. So I encourage you to try this hardware on your next project. Again, it takes a little bit of practice, but I'm confident that you can do it. If you do decide to use this hardware in a project, be sure to tag Sallie Tomato. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe for future tutorials. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.